like to welcome everybody to the Vashon Heritage Museum Talks. Tonight's presentation is on natural wonder, an island shaped by water. At this point, I'd like to say thank you to For Culture for sponsoring our talks. Really appreciate that. And I'm Elsa Kronquist, the Executive Director of the Heritage Museum. And I'd like to also introduce Chris Austin, who is on our museum board, who will also be helping us this evening. As is our tradition, we open our talks with a recognition of the Native people. And Chris, are you ready to do that?
Yes.
Thank you.
We acknowledge and recognize that we are on the ancestral lands and traditional home of the Shwabop's Coast Salish Native people, the first people of Vashon Island. This land was their home long before Euro-American voyagers and settlers came, and they were forcibly removed from these lands and relocated onto neighboring reservations, including Puyallup, Nisqually, Squaxin Island, and Muckleshoot. Vashon Island is their traditional home, and their historical relationship with the land continues today. We honor the island itself and the Shwabop's people, past and present.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And with that same intent, we state Black Lives Matter. Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. And now, Chris Austin, would you please introduce tonight's speaker?
Certainly. From land carved by ancient ice to the constant erosion of shoreline bluffs, water has shaped who we are and continues to shape who we become. In this talk, Bianca Perla, Executive Director of the Vashon Nature Center, will explore many different ways in which water has shaped our island's natural heritage as a prelude to the upcoming Natural Wonder Museum exhibit. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm talking tonight, but I want to recognize that a lot of people have given help and knowledge to this talk and also to the exhibit, and you'll see some of their names as I go through and at the end as well. But just keep that in mind that I'm kind of channeling a lot here. It's not just me in this talk that's created all this information. So I want to start here as we're looking at Shingle Mill Creek here coming out into the Puget Sound at Fern Cove. So you can kind of basically see the whole watershed here. And I want to start with a quote from Margaret Wise Brown's Little Island. She says, "Nights and days came and passed, and summer and winter and the rain. And it was good to be a little island, a part of the world, and a world all its own, all surrounded by the bright blue sea." So Vashon is an island. It's a part of the world and a world of its own. And this one fact is what makes our natural history different from any other place in the Puget Sound. The strictest definition of an island is a landmass that's smaller than a continent and surrounded by water. But ecologically, many different areas share similar properties and processes to islands. For example, parks can be islands in a sea of urban lands. And desert springs like this one that I used to study in the Grand Canyon is an island of water in a sea of desert. Even the Earth itself could be considered an island floating in space. And so on the one hand, we're special because we're an island, but on the other hand, because islands exist in many different forms and capacities, what we learn about the natural history of our island can be applied to many other areas and across many different scales, from the Earth to the continents, down to different islands that inhabit this world. So we're microcosms for a lot of things, being an island. So what's so unique about islands? Earth has 100,000 islands, which contain 20% of the global biodiversity. So islands are these isolated patches that create species because of that isolation over time. So they're kind of species creation engines in a way. In the Salish Sea, depending on how you define an island in terms of size, we have between 500 and 1,000 islands. And the Salish Sea is really the inland sea that we are part of, that stretches from the northern tip of Vancouver all the way down to the South Puget Sound. And the Salish Sea basin, 3.3% of the surface area is made up of islands, but 40% of the length of the shoreline is found on islands. So islands are super important resources for shoreline and marine species in the Salish Sea. 80% of known species extinctions have occurred on islands. So while islands are these speciation engines, they're also super vulnerable. They're smaller. And they're vulnerable to invasive species, land use modification, disease, and global climate change with sea level rise, among other things. And islands culturally spur innovation. A lot of the islands around the globe right now are leaders in energy, renewable energy and sustainability. And part of that might be because islands have more challenging habitats for sustainability, and people they feel that resource limitation more viscerally than you would if you're on the mainland. And smaller communities sometimes are more flexible and able to create novel solutions. And so islands are species engines, and they're also creativity engines culturally. The theory of island biogeography, which was created by E.O. Wilson and MacArthur, is one of the only real theories we have in ecology. And it was done by studying islands, where they looked at islands and saw that islands that are small and farther away from the mainland hold less species than islands that are large and closer to the mainland. And the rules that they tangled out from all of that basically set the groundwork for reserve design all over the world. So nature parks and preserves use the island biogeography theory and conservation planning to plan the sizes and connectivity of reserves. So while we are an island, I'm sure some of you are saying, does this really apply to Vashon? We're only a mile away from the mainland on Colville's Passage, and that's true. Our moat is pretty permeable, and we get flows and ebbs of different animals and plants across that moat. And so that also makes us unique, because it's that interplay of interchange and isolation that's unique to us. We get large carnivores, for example. This is the first record we have of a cougar on the island, and it was killed right in my neighborhood, Cross Landing, Reddings Beach area in 1915 at the Crosses place. And through the years, we've looked at newspapers. We've had waves of cougars coming over one by one throughout the years. And this is the best footage we have of our last confirmed cougar here in 2016. And we've had other reports since then, but nothing confirmed. But we have these guys coming over fairly regularly. We also have a history of having coyotes coming over. Mike Suddeth was really helpful in getting a big research project looking through all of the news records on Vashon for nature stuff. And he found a lot of things about the earliest records for these different species on the island. And this is a 1960 Beachcomber article. Roger Jensen proves his point. There really is a coyote on the island. And so here he is showing it. Bears have crossed the moat as well. And this is a 1958 article in the Beachcomber about fishermen from the island who saw a bear swimming, and they decided to lasso it, thinking that maybe they should take it to Point Defiance Zoo, an aquarium, but it died on the way. It drowned. So we got this footage from our camera of this little visitor up close and personal a couple years ago. See if you can decide what you think that was. Chris loves these videos. This is a farther away view. So this is a bear. So we're still getting bears that come over. looking for resources, usually during right before or after they've woken up from torpor or hibernation. We get younger, or we get smaller creatures as well. We're getting more beavers. This one was found by one of the Nature Center salmon watchers in Shingle Mill Creek a few years back. And tinier and tinier, we have lots of different animals that get here lots of different ways. This is on the right, Pristenicola spring snail I'm holding in my hand there. It's 2 millimeters long. The guy in the hat on the left is Ed Johannes, and he was doing a study of Pristenicola spring snails and asked me if there were any on the island. I didn't know at the time, but I knew a good spring to check. And so I asked my neighbor, Mike Tracy, and we went down into Christensen Ravine to see if we could find them. And of all of these guys that were looking around in the stream, who do you think found the spring snail first? It was this little girl. So kids are lovely to have around on expeditions when you're trying to find things. But this has an interesting story because with my work on desert springs, I knew that some snails in springs hitchhike on birds to get different places. And so I asked Ed, was that a possibility here? How did they get to Vashon? And he said, no, they really need to be in water all the time. They die really quickly in the air. And so they couldn't have hitchhiked on a bird. And I said, okay, so maybe they just floated over on a log. And he said, well, they couldn't stand the salinity. They would die. They need really cool, clean, oxygenated, fresh water. And I said, so how did they get here? And he said, well, they probably came over when Vashon was surrounded by fresh water. So, whoa, when was Vashon surrounded by fresh water? That takes us to the birth of the island. And so I'm just going to go back 20,000 years. We could go back a lot further, but 20,000 years ago, Vashon didn't exist. It wasn't surrounded by water. This is what the landscape would have looked like at the time, kind of like a high alpine forested environment, open forested environment, maybe like the Rockies. So if you were looking south towards Tacoma, this is kind of to orient you with Quartermaster Harbor, East Passage, and Colvos. Maybe we had saber-toothed cats roaming around and American lions at this time, nice open habitat, but no island. Then 17,000 years ago or so, the glaciers came down. For the past 2 million years, more than a dozen advances and retreats have happened. But this last glaciation is actually called the Vashon Glaciation because it's what carved the shape of Vashon that we see today. If you can see on the right, there are contour lines, and those actually show in feet the depth of the ice. So the depth of the glacier over Vashon at that time was 3,000 feet thick, pretty thick, and a lot of weight, which will come into play later. So after that glaciation reached its full extent, it started melting. And this might have been what it looked like, calving glaciers from Vashon. And as the glaciers receded away from Vashon, this might have been what it looked like. The braided streams might have been where Wax Orchards is today. Those ponds on the right could have been what Mukai Pond area and Island Center looked like. And down in on the bottom there, any stream valley on Vashon would be shallow like that at this point because it was just starting to be eroded and not very much vegetation because the ice had just left. If you were standing at Tahlequah looking south from here towards Tacoma, this might have been what it looked like at the time when the glaciers left, and we would have been surrounded by fresh water at that time. And so that's when these little guys would have come over 16,000 years ago. As time went on, the vegetation started to build. We got early pioneer species, alders, lichens, horsetails, a tundra-like environment. And about 14,000 years ago, we also have the first signs of human habitation in the area. This is a picture from Squim, where there was a mastodon kill site shown or found there with an arrowhead that was just dated till 14,300 years ago. And so people were in this area probably for at least that long. the glaciers also left us with other interesting habitats. I like to say that the glaciers is what started the land trust, right? Because this is the land trust was created to save Whispering Firs Bog, which is what you see in this picture. And Whispering Firs Bog was created by the glaciers. This is a LiDAR image, which means all of the vegetation has been stripped off and you can see the actual underlying pattern of the land on Vashon. And so you see on the left, those vertical striations are the scrapes from the glaciers and the glacial drumlins. And so in one of those north-south drumlins, facing drumlins, there are also a couple moraines, which are the terminal ends of the glaciers as they melted and stayed still for a while, and then they'd melt back. They'd deposit kind of a berm, which is a moraine. And so on the right-hand side here, you can see that, that there are two moraines that hem a little area in like this, and that's how this bog was formed. And it filled with rainwater, which is very low nutrient water, and sphagnum moss started to colonize it. Tom DeVries and students went in there and cored this moss and got lots of pollen that you can tell differences of plant communities through time. And also they could tell that the sphagnum moss mats by our time were 20 feet deep. So this is a fairyland that's filled with really unique plants that you wouldn't see otherwise, like bog laurel on the left and Labrador tea on the right. There you have a close-up of some of the sphagnum moss, and then our sundew plant, which is our only carnivorous plant on the island that lives in that bog. So really unique habitats that are created mostly by that glacial action. But besides leaving us unique habitats, the carving action of the glaciers that created our island also left us with potentially unique species. And this is Ellen Kritzman here, pictured on the left. She's an island resident and a mammologist. She used to work for Slater Museum. And one day going through the collections of voles at Slater Museum, she noticed an interesting pattern that island voles were bigger in body size than mainland voles. And there's actually a rule, Bergman's rule, that shows that this happens sometimes on islands, possibly because the islands are predator poor. And so these prey animals can grow bigger and be a little slower than they could on the mainland. So a few years ago, we tried to do some DNA on these guys to see if we had our own subspecies of voles, but we didn't get enough of a good sample size to really tease that question out. So it's still a mystery. Another thing that we are seeing is, speciation processes always potentially in action and happening right before our eyes today. We just did a pilot DNA test of island coyotes and found that the relatedness between coyotes here on the island is super high, which is pretty typical of island environments. It's probably the same with our deer, with our raccoons, maybe with our squirrels as well. And through time, there can be some things that happen from this. One thing is inbreeding depression could occur. So you could get a lethal gene in the population that just wipes these guys out. Another possibility is that you have enough genetic variation, or the genetic variation is robust enough that you actually get you start differentiating and getting a different variety of coyotes on the island, similar to British Columbia's sea wolves. These sea wolves swim from island to island. Their diet is mostly sea animals and scavenging, and they're a lot different than the mainland wolves also genetically. And so who knows what's going to happen with our wolves? Probably half the population is rooting for that lethal gene, and then the other half of the population is rooting for a new subspecies. But who knows what's going to happen? We do know that just like a lot of animals and humans on islands, that shorelines are really important, and coyotes use them for travel and also for scavenging and eating. So geologic history has really shaped and laid the groundwork for the patterns that we see today. And there's so much more we could go into about geology, but I'm going to leave it for the exhibit. Tom DeVries and Steve Bergman, the Vashon Island Geological Association, has done a really great job with the geology, and you're going to learn about earthquakes and fault lines and landslides and all sorts of other things that I'm not going into today. But one really big legacy of geologic history for us is our fresh water and how that works on the island. We are rain people. Unlike the people on the mainland who drink water that comes, a lot of it comes from glaciers, ours comes from the rain that falls on the surface of the island, and that's what we've got. And so the geologic history has really set up that pattern for us. This is a cross section of the island. So it's looking at, on the right is the North End Ferry, on the left is Tahlequah Creek, and it's sort of like somebody took a knife and sliced it right down the middle and opened up, and you're looking at the side. So maybe you're looking west, and you can see all of the creeks from north to south here. And you can see then the layers of the different sediments left by this glacial action and geologic history. So the first things that you see are these recessional outwash and ice contact deposits. So those are sands and gravels that are loose. They were melting off the sides of glaciers or in the outwash, and they never got compacted by the glaciers. So those sit above everything on the island and make kind of a shallow aquifer. And below it in this pink is the glacial till. And the glacial till is the most widespread deposit on the island, especially in the north end of the island. And it's a mixture of silt, sand, and clay it was basically smeared beneath the sole of the glaciers. So it took all that weight of the 3,000 feet of ice. And so it's very compacted and it's not very permeable. So it basically caps our deeper aquifer, and it keeps it from getting contaminated. So it's kind of like a protection in some cases. There are places on the island where, especially in creeks and along the shorelines, where you don't have that cap of glacial till. And so those are areas where things can enter the groundwater more easily. So in that green area below, you can see that there's a blue line going through, and that represents our groundwater level. This is this green area is advanced outwash deposits. So this forms the bulk of our biggest aquifer on the island. So that's where most of our wells are tapped. So that's where most of us are drinking from. And these deposits are sand and gravel that was deposited in those outwash channels of the glaciers as they receded north. And so these were not compacted by the glaciers either. And so that's where this water can rest in the interstitial spaces between the different gravels and sands. And then if you can see over to the right here, one thing that we need to keep our eye on is sometimes this aquifer isn't too far above sea level. And so that's something, you know, for rising sea levels, we want to look at, because that could mean that the seawater could infiltrate the aquifer in that area. Underneath these are the Lawton clay or undifferentiated deposits, depending on where you are in Puget Sound. And this dark green is composed of deposits that were laid down from ponds and lakes, Lake Russell being one. And it's really, really unpermeable. It's very, very dense. And this exists kind of at the bottom of our aquifer as an aquitard. There is, as I understand it, an aquifer that's even deeper than this, but it's not something that it exists below sea level here. So the same geologic pattern of soils that creates our sole source aquifer, our one aquifer on the island that we drink from, also creates vegetation patterns that we see today. So the north end of the island that you can see in green has a lot of that glacial till, which is more water retentive. As you go south, you get more of the outwash exposed. And so that is sandier soils. And that interacts with a precipitation gradient that's pretty extreme. We're kind of smashed in between these huge mountain ranges, And the way that that all works is we have a really extreme precipitation gradient just in the 4 miles between the west side of the island and the east side of the island at Point Robinson. There's a change in about 13 inches of rainfall annually. So Point Robinson gets 13 inches of rainfall less than my house does over on the west side of the island. And so that gradient plus slope and aspect and these different soils creates differences in our forests. For example, up in north in Shingle Mill, we've got a lot of cedars and water loving plants. As you go south to the number 2 in Frog Holler, you'll see more open Douglas fir forests with salal understory. That's really because of those drier soils. And then as you go to Maury Island, you have these south facing slopes, plus these sandier soils, plus less rain. And that combines with a history of fire to create those amazing open areas and madrone forests that we see on Maury. And so these interact with another forest that I'll get into soon here to create our vegetation. So this is the 1856 General Land Management Witness Tree Survey. Basically, it's the oldest record we have of what forests might have looked like in the Puget Sound area. And in 1856-57, surveyors from the General Land Management Office were tasked with plotting all of Puget Sound for eventual private property allocation and settlement. But in these records, they used what was called witness trees to mark the corners of quarter sections and that they mapped. And this gives us the ability to reconstruct these forests from their notes, because they also took lots of notes on understory as well. And there's a lot of things that I'm not going to go into on this slide that you'll learn about in the museum. But a few things are, we did have big trees. And the patterns, if you go over here and look at Vashon, the geologic patterns hold true. We have the cedar forests in dark green up north, and then we have the Douglas firs as you go south. And it's interesting that there's no big, large madrone forests on Maury Island at the time, and you'll learn about that maybe more in the exhibit. And so there are the geologic patterns that set up that vegetation pattern that we see are there, but then there's some anomalies that are interesting. In here, you can see some white areas, and those are not what we would expect. Those aren't big old growth forests. Those white areas represent burned areas, which is pretty interesting. And that comes to talking about disturbance. So the interesting thing when we look at this data is that the biggest tree was huge, 16 feet in diameter, but the average diameters of trees were basically what we're seeing today, almost 12 to 25 inches. So the clock was reset on Vashon many times. We weren't completely covered in this old growth forest. Windstorms, fires, landslides, especially on the shorelines, all set that clock back and made for younger trees in these forests through time. But the fires are interesting, and I want to focus on that just a bit. We go into it more in the exhibit, but the northern section you can see actually has a counterpart over on the Kitsap Peninsula, which makes some people wonder whether at some point this fire jumped from one end to the other across the Colvos Passage. But then there's another section of fire right here in Paradise Valley, Misty Isle area that's very interesting. And Raina Holtz was really great, and she went back and looked at these GLO records and looked at the actual understory notes for this area. And there's a couple interesting things about it. One is the location. It's pretty close to Quartermaster Harbor, which is where a lot of the Shabop settlements were. And so, it's really in proximity there. And it's also has a lot of places had a big fern understory, which is typical of areas that were burned by indigenous peoples for fern cultivation, berry cultivation, and hunting grounds. And so it just raises a question, maybe that was an indigenous burn area. There's no hard evidence or stories from the Puyallup tribe specifically about burning on Vashon, but there's plenty of Coast Salish stories all over the Puget Sound about how burning was used as a technique for cultivation of open areas. And so that just goes to show that this land and you know, our earliest records of it, they aren't this pristine forest. There have been, you know, for years and years and years, many people here that have been interacting with these geologically set patterns and changing them a little bit. And so that's something to really keep in mind, that there were people here that really learned how to live within these cycles of the land and increase the diversity of certain areas over time. And so this is a little different from what happened when the settlers came, and Euro-American settlement kicked off a period of widespread change. So the change that was just in a different magnitude altogether from the existing patterns that we see geologically. For example, as logging intensified, we started losing a lot of the forest species. So this is a species called the sooty grouse that likes old growth forest. That dropped out of Vashon fauna early on. Spotted owl, northern goshawk, Voss swift, maybe marbled murrelet as well, and ravens all are associated with those old growth forests and likely declined or were extirpated at this time. And then by 1907, a third of the island was logged. This is looking north, kind of from town. 21 mills were established on the island. Timber was a big industry and employer. And during this time, you can see that the bird life is changing. This is a picture of a Lewis woodpecker, which was actually captured more recently, but Lewis woodpeckers at this time would have been pretty plentiful because they love snags and burned areas. And that was a lot of what was happening at this point. And then we get to agriculture. After that, you guys can see the Presbyterian Church. This is downtown here. So there's the Presbyterian Church that's still there today. And you can see the large open fields and agriculture that came on the heels of the clearing and logging. And at that time, most of the deep forest birds had dropped out of the island, and we get more open area birds like the western meadowlark that's pictured here, western bluebirds, sparrows, other things that love those open areas were thriving in this environment. And then from the 1970s on, the farms started shrinking to pocket farms, and we get forest regeneration. We're now at about 73% of the island is covered in forest. And this forest probably looks pretty similar to a lot of the forested areas that were cataloged in 1856. And so a big testament to the resilience of nature in coming back and growing back. The understories of the forest are probably a little poorer than they were just from the intensity of land use, but the tree canopies and the birds along with it are coming back. We have ravens now again, and we have cavity nesting birds, flickers, and pileated woodpeckers. And so we're getting that forest counterpart coming back. So the forests are returning like normal, but there are other legacies of this time that are not so easily reversed. And this picture is a great juxtaposition that shows how environmental impacts lag and have a lag time with them. This is on the left, this is a harvest of salmon and trout from Judd Creek in the early 1900s. And then on the right is from the Sherman photo collection. And this is also at Judd Creek. These kids are holding up a salmon that's as big as the little one there. And so lots of salmon, plentiful, right in the same time that there's a lot of logging that will eventually affect these salmon populations in the background that you can see. So here's a graph that just depicts the sudden loss or the dramatic loss of salmon over time from 1870 until now. And this is Chinook salmon. 650,000 Chinook used to come back to the Puget Sound. I can't even imagine what that must have looked like. It must have been amazing. And then, you know, now we're down here at about 8,000 coming back a year. And so all of the ups and downs that we get about, ooh, it's a good Chinook season. No, it's not. Those are just basically nothing compared to what we used to have. And salmon are cyclical in terms of their populations, depending on ocean conditions and other things. And when you're up at, you know, 650,000, those cyclical changes don't matter that much. But when you get down here near zero, these cyclical changes could mean the difference between a species staying put on this earth and not. And so now we're starting to see the wider effects. The southern resident orcas were listed as endangered in 2005, and the resident orcas here eat only fish. And so they're having a hard time finding stuff to eat. This is tahlequah and double stuff swimming by the island here. And orcas are a beautiful, amazing top predator that it's sad to see is so connected to these salmon losses. But 137 different species are dependent upon salmon survival in the Pacific Northwest. And so salmon are really, you know, changes in salmon population are really much more worrisome in many cases than some of the smaller changes we were seeing through history in the bird populations. That the salmon is tied to all of our different habitats here in the Southwest or in the Northwest. So the stream habitat, the marine habitat, the shoreline habitat, and the forests. They exist at many different levels in the trophic food web. So the food web for the marine environment is shown here on the right. And it starts with phytoplankton converting energy from the sun and goes all the way up to these orca whales. And salmon exist at many different levels within this, depending on their age. And then when they spawn and they die, they become food for trees because 40% of the nitrogen that trees that are streamside get is from the ocean, and it's through salmon. And so salmon are really important connectors in our environment here and on the island. So this is a picture of the 1960s picture of the Sportsman's Club, and by the 1960s it was pretty obvious that salmon populations were declining, and the Sportsman's Club really is the first example of a community group that took responsibility for the settlers that took responsibility for stewarding our natural resources. So the first kind of community scientists, I'd say. And they worked with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to try some restocking of salmon stocks. And this is a picture of them pumping thousands and thousands of Chinook salmon into Robb's Lagoon. And Robb's Lagoon was the first saltwater rearing pond in the state. And it was thought that the salmon could rear there and go out to the ocean and then come back and populate a certain number of creeks, since they weren't imprinted on any one in particular. This was a failed experiment, mostly because if any of you have swam in Robb's Lagoon, you know it gets really hot in the summer. And so it surpassed the ability of these salmon to survive. And there were a lot of fish kills in this area. But one of the reasons that, you know, salmon were declining despite local efforts is that they use so many different habitats. So they're using our island habitats, but they're also using the wide oceans. And so they're cumulative impacts that are affecting these populations. The 4 H's, hydropower, so dams, harvesting, habitat, which here in the Puget Sound, I want to include water quality in that habitat and call that out, because as lands around Vashon get more and more urbanized, we're becoming, stormwater runoff is becoming more and more of a problem, to the point that some of these salmon die before they can even spawn because they hit these creeks during storms where there's this toxic runoff that, that doesn't allow them to survive. So, and then hatcheries, decreasing the genetic variability and resilience of these populations. And now it's time to add a fifth H that's affecting salmon, which is heat. And this is what we're seeing recently, are these global climate change caused marine heat waves. And you can see here, this is called the blob on the right. And it's basically overlapping the same area that our Puget Sound salmon, all of them, use for migration. And so this heat is important because in hotter waters, the plankton is not as nutritiously dense and calorically dense as in cold water. That's why everything from the island goes up north certain times of year to get that really dense food source. And so when the ocean is warming, we're finding that these salmon aren't getting enough to eat. They're coming back to the streams smaller. They have smaller body sizes altogether, and that propagates up the food chain as well. So here's some salmon count data from the Nature Center salmon watching program. And before we started it, a long community effort to catalog salmon. So this goes back to 2001. And so I just plunked in the different warm water events during the time of this data collection. This is standardized per effort because we had different number of observers per year. This is number of salmon per observer. And you can see that it roughly correlates, this is in Shingle Mill Creek, to these warm water events. We get these kind of cyclical crashes of the population. This happens in Judd as well for the most part. So that brings me to the last habitat that I'm going to spend a lot of time on here because it's one of our most important on the island in terms of our regional importance. Salmon are not only tied to our forests and our streams and our marine areas, they're really tied to our shorelines, probably more so region-wide than any other habitat we have on the island. And our shorelines may be important habitat that defines us as islanders culturally as well. And we'll go into that a little bit. 60% of the undeveloped shoreline in King County exists on Vashon, making us a regional important for that in countywide. And salmon in northern rivers like the Stillaguamish have been found foraging along our shores. So it was thought before salmon tagging research was done, it was thought that those salmon in the northern rivers would go straight out the Strait of Juan de Fuca when they came out of their rivers, but instead they turn south and they come down into the Puget Sound, and a lot of them forage along our shoreline. So our shorelines are super important resources for lots of salmon, not just the ones that come out of our creeks. Shorelines are also one of our most diverse habitats. As the organisms that use our shorelines aren't bound by those island principles that the terrestrial organisms are. They are lapping up against our shores as part of this giant marine matrix that surrounds us. So shorelines are also the longest inhabited areas of our island. This is a picture of Lucy Duran. She was the last member of the Shabops to live on the island, and she's buried at the Vashon Cemetery. In 1927, she testified in the U.S. Court of Claims trial with other Coast Salish elders, and she testified about broken treaty promises and the location of villages around Vashon. And so she's given us a lot of information about the early indigenous settlement of Vashon. So the Shabops mostly concentrated their living in 7 villages in Quartermaster Harbor and then out in Tahlequah. And they did also go to the uplands for foraging, but they were mostly concentrated on those shorelines. And possibly because of their sophisticated water-based traveling, they never had a name for Vashon as a whole. They concentrated on different places. And here are some place names that were used in different places of the island. So, you know, hollering across Point Robinson, wide Point Vashon, enclosed was what they called inner quartermaster harbor, and sleeping mats area is where Peter Point is. And it's interesting to look. My mom was a linguist, and so I'm thinking about, you know, a lot of the differences that you can see between cultures in the way that they name things, or in their languages. And so you can see kind of the interactiveness of the left-hand column there versus sort of the, you know, honoring of people by giving them a place name, or the more kind of ownership qualities of the right-hand column. And that's kind of an interesting thing to look at there. Early Euro-American settlers also conceived of the island in the way, in terms of not being an entity, but rather separate spots along the shoreline. This is a quote from Bruce Holman's Brief History of Vashon. He says, by 1893, most islanders identified not with the island as a whole, but with their local community, its churches, its schools, its stores, post offices, places of employment, and homes. Even in 1920, it was easier to get from Cove to Ellisport by catching a steamer to Tacoma and then another to Ellisport than it was to try to make the journey across the island. And so real water-based cultures at this time. We see the Euro-American settlers were using resources on the shoreline too. Those bricks are from that Lawton clay layer. And so we have the Beaker Brickyard and many other brickyards popping up along the shorelines. We also have the Mosquito Fleet, which is a ferry system that allows people to navigate by the water and focuses those towns on the shorelines there. And Dockton was the biggest dryland dock west of the Mississippi, and from 1892 to 1909. And so there was a big emphasis on living on the shoreline and in that interface between land and sea for a long period of our history. The Shabops people and Euro-American settlers not only used the resources like the bricks and other things that the Shabops people used a lot of the resources like the fish. And in Jensen Point archaeological dig, herring was the biggest, most prevalent fish. Salmon took a second to it in that archaeological dig. And so Pacific herring, surf smelt, and Pacific sand lance are all what we call forage fish. They underpin the bottom of the food web, and they spawn along Vashon shores. They come up in high tides and they spawn on our beaches. And Pacific herring spawns specifically on eelgrass and other substrates in that zone. And so we're now seeing crashes of that big population of herring, as well as the crashes in salmon. And so these are you know, ecologically worrisome, but they're also culturally worrisome, both for indigenous people and for us. Some of the reasons that we have for declining populations is the health of Quartermaster Harbor is not very good. There are lots of oxygen levels that fall below state standards in the fall, especially in the inner harbor. The Pacific herring spawning has reached 0 multiple times in the last recent years. Audubon has done an amazing job of documenting a 95% decline of the Western grebe population. And I wanted to show that you know, that there is a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus loading of the harbor, but not all of it's coming from septics. There's a lot of upland nitrogen coming down from streams. So anything within these watersheds that drain into Quartermaster Harbor is also contributing to that load. It's not just the beaches. So all of these trends, these downward trends, are happening despite a great increase in protected areas on the island. The whole area that you see here in blue is the Maury Island Aquatic Reserve. And then we also have other protected areas, and they form a skeleton that's probably helping but it's definitely not enough. And so, in recent years, here on Vashon and all over the globe, we're asking, what else is it that we need to do to adapt? We're realizing that we can't just set aside certain protected areas and that will be enough for species that travel these great distances like herring and salmon. And so we're starting to reinvent how we're relating to our resources. And one of the things that is happening more on the island now is that we're trying to restore habitat and processes, and with the eye of making us more adaptable to climate change impacts and increasing habitat for important species like salmon. So for example, King County and the Land Trust have been putting more woody debris in streams. And what that does is it helps create pools so that as summer days get hotter, which is what's predicted for climate change, there will be refuges of cool water. And then in winter storms are supposed to get more intense. And so when winter storms come through, these pools and these logs will hopefully work on slowing down the flows. Also, planting in the riparian areas slows down the flows if you have more tree cover. So restoring processes and habitat is becoming just as important as protected areas. This is happening on the beaches too, with the predicted levels of sea level rise. We know that these beaches where those 3 forage fish spawn are going to become, especially on bulkheaded areas, the water is going to become too deep for them to spawn, and that's worrisome because they do underpin the whole food web in the Puget Sound. And so King County is buying shoreline areas from willing landowners and doing much more than just holding them in a park. They're doing very ambitious restoration efforts where they're taking down bulkheads and they're also taking down the structures. And this is, recognizing that bulkheads cannot be taken down everywhere, but it's an effort to create some refuges for these fish. And the Nature Center is monitoring these areas, and it's part of a large Puget Sound wide study. And we're finding this is a before and immediately after restoration. This is 2 years after restoration. We're finding that this shoreline restoration creates habitat not only for forage fish, but also for juvenile salmon who use our shorelines. So it increases overhanging vegetation for one, and that vegetation feeds juvenile salmon that go along the shorelines to about 70% of their diet comes from terrestrial insects that fall from that overhanging vegetation. And so it's also creating rich habitat with logs and beach wrack, which is the seaweed that comes up. And it's also allowing some of the sediment to come down on the beach. If you can see the sandy beach right here, and you can see how it was rocky before, this is creating sediments that are really good for forage fish spawning for their eggs. So another element of what we can do is, as private citizens, taking care of our own land that isn't in protected areas. And I'm going to come back a little bit to that whole idea at the start of that we are an island of our own, but we're also part of the wider world. And for forces like climate change, that's really important. Here's a quote from Derek Churchill, who is an islander and a forester for DNR, saying that the most important action we can do for our forests on the island is to dramatically and quickly reduce carbon. So it's kind of this balance of taking care of our home and also working on these larger scales to change things for the better. So we are seeing some increases directly due to human action. We now have more gray whales in the Puget Sound than we did before. And we do have some resilient ecosystems, like the eelgrass is still holding steady in Quartermaster Harbor and other places around the Sound, and even improving in some areas. And so we know with restoration and with protected areas, and if we put our minds to it, we can make these changes happen. However, we're really living at this pivotal time because we are really affecting the earth on a large scale as humans. Since the rise of human civilization, 83% of wild mammals have been lost in terms of biomass. And now we make up 96%, us and our livestock make up 96% of the biomass of all mammals on Earth. Only 4% of the biomass on Earth comes from wild animals. So we are really making a huge impact. We are changing a lot of those geologic processes and patterns that have been set down. And it's prompting many people to say that we're entering a new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene. So we have become a geologic force like those glaciers. And this realization fundamentally changes that dominant story of humanity from one where the natural world is plentiful and immense and always with a wild frontier to one that is more island-like with limited resources. And we've created kind of this environmental crisis, but it's not really a crisis of ability. We have the knowledge in many cases. We have a good idea of what needs to be done to turn things around, to get some of those graphs rising again. And we're doing that. But it's rather right now kind of a crisis of culture, of being between stories. There's an old dominant story that's reaching its limit of utility for serving our species, but another story has not yet taken hold to guide us. And so we may need more than restoration. We may need, as Robin Wall Kimmerer says, restoration. We might need a new story. We need to start thinking about our relationship with the world differently. What if we could be keystone species, for example, that benefited and encouraged these life processes and encouraged biodiversity? And so that's where I'm going to leave you guys. I'm going to end with that question of what is this new story going to be? And islands and island cultures have a lot to contribute to a story of sustainability and abundance and creativity. We are creative centers for speciation and also for cultural creativity. And so what is it that we have to contribute to this new story? And I'd love to hear people's ideas, and that's something that we'll probably ask for people reflecting on in the exhibit as well as you go through. So that's all I've got. I want to just reiterate that this is a team effort. There are so many people involved in supporting the natural history exhibit, and I've just scratched the surface of things, believe it or not. So now I guess I'll take questions if there are any, and stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Bianca. That was a wonderful presentation. And we do have a question about regarding toxic runoff. Can you share the top offenders in the content of stormwater?
Yeah. Well, right now the big I'm not going to remember any of the actual chemical names. I'm sorry, but one of the biggest offenders that we're finding out is that we've got these strange chemicals in tires that are getting eroded. And the interesting thing about it is there is a chemical that is made that's a combination of the tire, the chemicals that are coming off the tires, and something in the environment that turns it more toxic. And so it was a really, really hard process to figure all of this out, where this was coming from. And it really has wide implications for when you know what you're putting in something, and you know these things aren't maybe super toxic. We haven't really thought about how they interact with other things in the environment and might become more toxic, which is what's happening here. So that's the big one right now that's causing a lot of the salmon toxicity.
Thank you. Someone is saying this is a fascinating lecture, and thank you. And what is your favorite meso predator?
Who asked me that?
Someone a panelist who could actually have asked you that.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, I love coyotes. I think they're so cool. And here they kind of act as a top predator. but in other places they act as a mesopredator. And, you know, I know they're annoying and they cause a lot of pain for a lot of people too, but they are amazing animals and they're so adaptive and so smart and so family oriented. I gotta say that would be my favorite.
Okay, so everybody, please put your questions in the chat. And here's another one. Oh, can you make your slide set available?
Oh, yeah.
We will have this this is being recorded and it will be on the museum's website. But Steve Evans wants to know if you can make your slide set available. Much good data. Someone else is asking, would it help to open up Portage fill to allow the water to flow more freely?
Oh, I'm so glad I got asked that question because I have my own idea about that I haven't really run by very many people. So it was thought that opening up Portage would help with the circulation of the harbor, but there was a study done that showed the way that the currents go there on the other side of the bridge, it actually even if you opened up the land there really wouldn't be a lot of flushing that happened because the current that comes ripping around in Tramp Harbor kind of stops it from going out. But I think I've been thinking about this more and more. A few years ago, or a few years now, we've seen herring at KVI and they get caught in the marsh there sometimes. And it's some sort of a holding area. And I can't, you know, I've been starting to think, you know, I wonder if that Colvos Passage, or I'm sorry, the Portage there was a movement corridor for fish at some point. You know, I mean, it would, if fish are coming from the north, it would be so much easier if you're a spawning salmon to go right over Portage and get into Judd Creek than it would be to go all the way around Maury or all the way around the southern tip. And so I wonder if the real utility of that is a marine wildlife corridor for herring as well, maybe. So I don't know how much. It doesn't sound like much flushing would happen, unfortunately, doing that. But maybe we get more wildlife coming in.
Yes. Okay. When will Natural Wonder open, and how long will it be at the museum?
That's
go ahead and answer that.
So we're hoping to open the outdoor portions this summer, you know, starting with the orca tent that Elsa was talking about, the special exhibit in the backyard that from the Natural History Museum. We're working on opening geology at the same time and then opening the shorelines, which will be outside shortly after, and then opening the rest of the exhibit that's indoors in November. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good
really. Plug. Good. That's what I'm hoping too. Again, people want to know about the recording, and we should have it on the website at VashonHeritageMuseum.org by mid next week.
Okay.
Let's see, a lot of thank yous, and this was fantastic. Let's see, thank you, Bianca, grounded in history and positive encouragement for our value as an island. This keeps, my questions keep moving around, so I just lost that one. I'm sorry. Let's see. Well, okay, here's a new question. How is climate change likely to affect the Vashon rain replenished water supply?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the conventional wisdom from the climate models is that we're going to have longer, hotter, drier summers, followed by winters that have more intense storm events. So harder rains, just dumping all at once. And so some of the impacts of that, and this is why stream restoration, rain gardens, anything you can do to get impervious surface off the island is important, is when you have these extreme rain events rather than those like nice little Vashon mists, though there's more runoff. There's not enough time for it to soak in. And so anything that we can do to help that water soak in more, planting trees so that, it falls on the leaves and then gets slowed down, creating those pools in the streams, making rain gardens and having places where it soaks in is really important. And that will help us get through those longer summers, because it'll replenish the aquifer more. That's kind of a short answer. I know I'm seeing some other things.
Short but good. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions, except for people are asking when the museum is going to be open. So the museum will be open, as Bianca said, the outside. We'll open the outside exhibit, Natural Wonder, in July. And hopefully, if we're allowed, the plan is to open the inside in the fall. We'll say the fall. So we'll let everyone know. A lot of thank yous, Bianca, for coming in. So that's it. Well, thank you, everybody. If there are no more questions, I think we'll say good night.
Okay, great. Oh,
Oh.
there's a raised hand.
Somebody just wrote.
Can you see that?
Okay, north end, in the north end, seeing many stressed, dying, and dead red cedars. Is this global warming? ? Drought? ?
Yeah, that's hard to know without looking at them. But cedars are kind of water loving, so it's possible that there's something going on there water wise. I think probably getting a forester or a horticulturist out there to look at them is probably, because they can get, cedars are pretty healthy, but they can get insect damage and some diseases too. So I don't know what it would be. Yeah.
What's the best way to amplify the lessons on Vashon for the Salish Sea?
Okay, so scaling up what we learn on Vashon for the Salish Sea, maybe. Well, I mean, I think that it's a good question. I mean, I think really a lot of what we're learning about our shorelines and the sustainability of our shorelines is applicable to a lot of places around the Salish Sea, because we have 400 other islands and we have mainlands with shorelines. So anything shoreline related is pretty applicable without any sort of changes. And I think in terms of innovations and community care for the land, there might be some things that we're doing on Vashon that could be examples for the wider Salish Sea. Yeah.
Okay. Next question here, given that deforestation caused our topsoil to wash away, is there any original left, and can it be regenerated?
Well, I mean, I think that our soils are really young. Even the topsoils, that washed away were really, really young in terms of geologic time. If in the whole West Coast, really, and anywhere where the glaciers went over, it's pretty poor topsoil. It's one of the reasons we have conifers and not hardwoods. But it's just time building it, with a lot of the leaf fall. And one thing that would be really great is if we could restore salmon populations, because those nutrients and get into the system a lot more and would increase the productivity and probably increase the cycling that would lead to that topsoil regeneration. I'm sure that there are other tips for topsoil regeneration that maybe farmers would know better than me, or foresters, but speaking ecologically and within the ecological interactions, that's what I would say is start restoring those species that give us more nutrients and kick that cycle into high gear. Yeah.
Oh, here's someone who says, you are so knowledgeable and the island is lucky to have you. Thank you for all the work you do.
Oh, that's sweet.
Thanks
Thanks.
to all
I just
panelists.
wanna say
Hey.
that reiterate that, I'm channeling a lot of people here. I've learned from a ton. We've got so much knowledge here on the island that just a lifetime of listening can, it's really where it's coming from. So.
Mhm. Well, I keep saying the Natural Wonder exhibit is going to be amazing and wonderful. And I know that we have something like 60 biologists and scientists and historians and who are involved in it. And it really is a community project. And it's going to be amazing when it opens up.
Yeah.
So thank you. I think we'll say there's no more questions. So I think no, that was from Chris Austin about raccoons.
Yeah, he's just giving me a hard time.
We'll say good night and thank you very much.
Thank
Just
you.
stick a bear on you, Chris.
Thank you, Bianca. That was wonderful.